Hello, this is Greg Allison with Green Greg's Garden and Worm Farm coming to you on the 24th of June, 2020, and have a special guest today, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. Dr. Pry is the Executive Director of the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security, among many other things. And he served on the Congressional Task Force that was tasked with trying to figure out what the threat was to the United States of America. And Dr. Pry just released a paper, a white paper, on the 10th of June this year called China EMP Threat. And he details that China is planning an EMP attack on the United States of America. So we're about to get all into this. By the way, Dr. Pry is the author of many books, excellent books, including this one, Blackout Wars, which he has personally signed to me. So thank you, Dr. Pry, for that. And he is, in my mind, the dean of power grid defense. There are many people involved in power grid defense of high, great caliber, including people like Ambassador Hank Cooper and the former head of the CIA, Woosley. So we have a lot of incredible people involved in this community, but Dr. Pry has really been at the forefront pushing this message. A lot of people think that when we talk this, that we're putting out fear porn. No, we're trying to get people to take action and get our grid hardened. That is the purpose of this book. I had 2 power grid defense conferences, and that was the purpose of them. We're trying to get people to take action. I will be in the future posting links for things that you can do to take action to harden the grid, to save our country, to take away the temptation of the threat that Dr. Pry is about to outline to us. And we also need to individually prepare. And one of the top things is growing food. So I'm going to do many more videos on this. We're going to get more proactive on it. So I ask you to subscribe to my channel, bang the update notification bell, and click all. And come back occasionally and check to make sure you're actually getting the updates to my videos or notifications. Some topics are somewhat less than favored by some algorithms from time to time. Now, that said, you can also support my channel, and I am looking for your support by clicking my links below. Like I said, you need to grow your own food. I have links to True Leaf Market that you can buy heirloom seeds from. You need heirloom seed plants so that you can harvest the seeds and replant them, because if the grid goes down, you're not going to be buying anything from the stores or internet. All you're going to have is what you got. So you better get ready. And also to prepare, you can buy long-term food storage. We got a special running out right now on prepwithgreg.com. You get $100 off of a 1-month supply of food that lasts like 25 years. And you can, through that link, click into my Patriot Supply, and that also supports me, and get all kinds of prepping supplies. Okay, all that said, let's get on with the interview here. Dr. Pry, Peter, tell me what you see personally as the key elements of this threat. Tell us what you see as the threat here.
Well, thank you for having me on, Greg, to talk about this vitally important and but esoteric subject. You know, most people are still unaware of the severity of the EMP attack and what it really is, and of its reality. And the reason we're here today to talk about this, which is first, you know, to just prepare your audience, you know, this is the greatest threat that our civilization faces. It's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of the Congressional EMP Commission on which I serve, that has labored for 20 years to try to get our country protected from this threat. You know, we're an electronic civilization, and the electromagnetic pulse, you can think of it as a threat that subtracts technology from the equation of our society. You know, we can't support a nation of 330 million people, you know, without electronics. And that's basically what the EMP would do. It would sweep away that modern technology and leave us trying to keep alive a population that's designed to be protected and supported by our electronic civilization. That's why the EMP Commission assessed that if we had a nationwide blackout that lasted 1 year, resulting from an EMP, it would collapse the electric grid. All the other life-sustaining critical infrastructures would also collapse. Telecommunications, transportation, business and finance, food and water. And as a consequence of that, we could lose 90%, 9 of 10 Americans could die from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. And that may sound outrageous, but you just try to think about how do you keep 330 million Americans alive for a year without food and without water? You can't do it. The EMP Commission tried for 8 years to think of a way of doing it. And in the end, we had to warn Congress that if our electric grid and other critical infrastructures remain vulnerable to this threat, that our enemies and the sun, Mother Nature, could take down our civilization. Now the reason I'm talking about this, to put a more optimistic view, is because there is no excuse for us to be vulnerable to EMP. This is one existential threat that we can actually do something about. And it's really a crime that our government has failed to protect our civilian critical infrastructures so that we're in this situation. Russia and China have protected their civilian critical infrastructures, but we haven't. Now let's go to the technical matter. What is an EMP? Well, first, there's 3 ways an EMP can be caused, that could produce the threat that I'm describing. The first one is from the sun. Solar storms happen all the time, so it's a natural EMP threat. And every year we experience solar storms that disrupt electric grids and cause air traffic problems, but most of these yearly annual solar storms, none of them are existential threats. What we're worried about is the once in 100-year solar superstorm, like the Carrington event that happened in 1859. That's the most powerful solar superstorm we have on record. It doesn't mean it's the only one. The electric power industry, for example, claims that they're protecting against the Carrington event when they're really not. And a lot of people act as if, or think as if, well, it can't be more powerful than the Carrington event. That was only 150, 170 years ago. The Earth has been around 4.5 billion years. And scientists have found indications that we've had much more powerful EMPs from the sun in the past than when we know from observing the stars that other solar systems like ours have put out coronal mass ejections that would have been more powerful than the 1859 Carrington event. Well, what happened in 1859 when we had that solar storm? Even though we were not yet an electronic civilization, the telegraph system, we were in the infancy of becoming an electronic civilization, and the telegraph systems all over the world, and every continent of the world except Antarctica, there were telegraph systems. Every place the colonial powers built a railroad that stringed a telegraph line along it. So were the telegraphs in India, in China, in North and South America, and in Europe, and places in Africa, and all over the world. The pulse was a worldwide phenomenon, and it basically destroyed the telegraph system so that the telegraphs failed. It wouldn't operate. The pulse was so powerful that telegraph keys were melted. Fires broke out in telegraph stations. There were forest fires because the telegraph lines in some places actually natural EMP pulse. And the transatlantic cable, we had just connected Europe and North America with a transatlantic telegraph cable in 1859. And the pulse was so powerful it reached down miles deep into the Atlantic Ocean and destroyed that cable. Now, civilization did not end in 1859 because we were not yet an electronic civilization. Those were still the horse and buggy days. Most people were still farmers, and the cities were still 75% of the population were doing farming and the like. But if something like that happened today, now that we are an electronic civilization, our modern microelectronics are literally about 1 billion times more vulnerable to the EMP from the solar phenomena than the crude telegraph systems of 1859. It would collapse electric grids, telecommunications, transportation, business and finance, all the things that are needed to support the lives of 330 million Americans. It would happen not just in America, but all over the world simultaneously. So that's one of the biggest threats we're concerned about, the recurrence of a solar superstorm like the 1859 Carrington event. And we know these things recur and do happen. In 1989, there was a storm called the Hydro-Quebec storm. Now, it was not a Carrington event. It was about 100 times less powerful than the Carrington event. But it put half of Canada into blackout in 90 seconds and even reached into the United States and melted the coils of a transformer, an extra high voltage transformer at a nuclear power plant. And it destroyed other transformers as well in Canada. And those transformers, just think about this. They were designed normally to carry 750,000 volts. 750,000 volts was normal, but in less than 90 seconds, the coils in that transformer were melted. Just imagine the energy that's needed to melt the coils of a transformer that's designed to take 750,000 volts. That wasn't the Carrington event. That was the 1989 Hydro-Quebec storm that's about 1% as powerful as the Carrington event. NASA, we were narrowly missed by a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection in 2012, July 23rd, 2012. It missed us by a few days. And NASA's assessment was that would have inflicted a Carrington event on us. And at that time, they calculated that the likelihood of the recurrence of a Carrington event is 12% per decade. 12% per decade. That virtually guarantees that within our lifetimes, or no later, that of our grandchildren, we're going to experience one of these existential Carrington events that basically collapses electric grids and wipes out electronic civilization all over the world. So that we need to be prepared for that. And we know how to protect our electric grids. We can do it, and it doesn't even cost that much. Now, the next threat that we're concerned about is the nuclear EMP threat. All it takes is any kind of a nuclear weapon. It doesn't have to be a special nuclear weapon, although there are nuclear weapons that are specially designed to make extraordinarily powerful EMP fields. But because the electric grid isn't protected at all, you could use any nuclear weapon, something like the Hiroshima or Nagasaki kind of bombs, a crude first-generation nuclear weapon. If you could get that weapon anywhere over the United States, above an altitude of 20 kilometers, it's going to cause a catastrophic EMP. Now, at about 30 kilometers, the radius would be about 600 kilometers on the ground. That doesn't cover the whole United States, but it would fry most everything within that radius of 600 kilometers. The transformers, the switches, the control systems called SCADAs that are in the electric grid. All of that stuff, millions of these pieces of equipment would be destroyed in the electric grid. Millions, okay? Well, what happens when even one thing goes wrong with the electric grid? We know from the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003 that if you even have a single point failure, it can put 50 million Americans into the dark. That happened in 2003. A tree branch came in contact with a high power voltage line and caused an upset, a single point upset that rippled through the electric power grid and put the whole northeastern United States in the blackout, including New York City. For 12 hours, people had to walk home across the subways because the subways wouldn't run. 50 million Americans in the dark. That's from a tree branch, all right? Imagine what would happen to the national electric grid, if you had a nuclear EMP attack that took out a big chunk of the grid's electronics over a radius of 600 kilometers. Millions of pieces of equipment fail. It's inevitable, as Dr. Graham testified to Congress, the free world's foremost EMP expert. It's inevitable that you would have a protracted blackout of the whole national grid if you could just do that. And what would be required to do that? A simple, crude, first-generation atomic weapon, that a country like Iran could build. You wouldn't need a missile to deliver it. A balloon, a high, heavy lift meteorological balloon would be sufficient to get you up to 20 to 30 kilometers altitude.
I used to fly those. I've flown rockets on those kind of balloons that have enough weight-bearing capability to launch just what you're talking about. And I've done it from the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm familiar with sea launch of high-altitude balloons that can carry the weight required to deliver just what you're saying. I've done it on a shoestring budget, basically. So if I could do it, imagine anybody could do this if they so desired.
Yes, in France, there was a European acrobat who lofted himself above an altitude of 30 kilometers with a balloon and parachuted from that distance just for his own personal dime. So if you've got an international terrorist organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or others of these, that have millions of dollars at their disposal, that's a real threat. In Iran, that is no more. Even the Obama administration, that I think was extremely optimistic about the status of the Iranian nuclear weapons program, because I think Iran has already got the bomb. But even the Obama administration estimated that Iran was within 6 months to a year of getting an atomic bomb when they concluded the Iran nuclear deal, on which Iran has cheated at every turn. So Iran is the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism, and North Korea has stated that it's willing to sell nuclear weapons. It's been willing to provide ballistic missile technology and nuclear weapons. So they're a definite possible proliferator. They have, they've sold missiles to anybody who has the money to buy them. Iran's missile program, the Nodong, for example, which is the Iranian Shahab 3 is derived from the North Korean Nodong, and there are North Korean scientists in Iran helping them with their space and missile program. Iran, by the way, just recently orbited successfully the Noor-1, which is a satellite, over the United States. And they're planning to launch the Noor-2 sometime in June, according to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Iranian space program, by the way, is run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That's not NASA. This is the world's greatest, deadliest terrorist organization that is orbiting satellites over the United States. And Iran knows about EMP. They write about it as a means of taking down the United States in their official military textbooks. So this nuclear EMP attack, let me explain a little bit more of the physical details so people could understand it, though. It happens in outer space at a minimum altitude of 20 to 30 kilometers, but you could go up to 400 kilometers. The higher you go, the bigger the EMP field gets on the ground. So if you wanted to cover the whole United States, you could do it from an altitude of actually less than 400 kilometers. Which Peter, about 300 kilometers.
Yeah, Peter, that happens to be the orbit level of the low Earth orbit satellite. So a satellite can cover the entire continent of the United States. And correct me if I'm wrong, according to Dr. William Graham, who had been actually the acting director of NASA at one point, and is a EMP expert, as you mentioned, physicist, and Soviet weapons expert also. He testified to Congress in 2008. It's in the congressional record that when the Soviet Union broke up, that generals from the Soviet Union, now Russia, had informed him that they had EMP super weapons capable of putting out 200,000 volts per meter on the electric lines below, which is 4 times our hardening standard. And if I understand correctly, it would have a field strength at the edge of this field, which can encompass the entire continental United States, of excess of 50,000 volts per meter, which is the hardening standard. So they could take out hardened facilities, military hardened facilities, across all the United States. That is something that I think a lot of people don't understand, and they don't understand how that could totally neutralize our response and ability to deal with an attack. But we can expand on that further. But I think that's a crucial thing that a lot of people miss. So what do you think?
No, you're right. You're right. Dr. Graham is literally the free world's foremost expert on EMP. He was on the defense science team that discovered the EMP phenomena during this 1962 Starfish Prime high-altitude nuclear test. And since 1963, it's spent a professional lifetime protecting, hardening U.S. military systems against EMP. And along the way, as you noted, he ran NASA and served as President Reagan's White House science advisor. And then he was my boss on the EMP Commission, on and off for 17 years, from 2001 to 2017. And he did so testify to Congress. When we talk about the hardening standards, things being hardened to 50,000 volts per meter, that's the top hardening standard that we have, which is far exceeded by the capabilities of super EMP weapons. People need to understand that none of the civilian critical infrastructure is hardened at all against EMP. It's not hardened to 50,000 volts per meter. It's not hardened to anything. Only our military systems are hardened against EMP, and then only a tiny fraction of those military systems, most of them associated with nuclear weapons delivery and command and control, communication satellites and the like. A very small percentage of our conventional forces are hardened against EMP, like the aircraft carriers. but nothing else is hardened to 50,000 volts. And the aircraft carriers are not hardened to 50,000 volts. Not everything is hardened to that high level, So basically, with a super EMP weapon, you could take out our best protected military systems, and that addresses one of the objections that people have, the perpetual optimists who want to say, well, we don't have to worry about EMP because we can retaliate. The same philosophy that worked during the Cold War, where we would use mutual assured destruction, and if they hit us, we'll hit them back. Well, how are you going to hit them back if your forces are fried and paralyzed? You can't communicate with your submarines at sea. It takes away your retaliatory capabilities. The other thing it does is it blinds you, because the gamma rays go out and they hit the satellites, and EMP also fries satellite ground stations that are needed to collect the data from the satellites. It happens at the speed of light. So that you're blinded. And our satellites are the most important part of it, and ballistic missile early warning radars also get fried. And these are our most important national technical means to determine, well, who attacked us? Deterrence only works when you know who attacked you. That's one of the other things EMP is such an important attack option, because not only can you potentially take away a person's retaliatory capabilities by frying the forces if you've got a super EMP weapon, but you can also do it anonymously, potentially, by blinding the national technical means that are necessary to identify who attacked you. Deterrence only works if you know against whom to strike back. And low-tech powers like Iran, could also, and terrorists could also do this. Even the, you could launch an EMP attack, as I said earlier, by balloon. You could also do it by a short-range missile or a medium-range missile launched off a ship. The Shahab 3 that the Iranians have is ideal for being launched off a ship. It could be put in the hold of a tanker. It's a mobile missile. It's designed to be moved around. You take the hatch off the tanker and launch it out of the ship. The Iranians actually practiced doing that before the EMP Commission even existed. They actually practiced doing that in the Caspian Sea. So they've got a demonstrated capability to do a ship-launched EMP attack. And they conducted a number. While the EMP Commission was in existence from 2001 to 2008, I think they launched about 6 Shahab 3s to high altitude to test high altitude fusing. Could they do fusing at high altitude? And they did all of them successfully. The world press reported them as failed launches because they were fusing the missiles at high altitude, but they were actually doing what was necessary. As Dr. Graham testified to Congress, he could see no other explanation for that except that they were practicing using for an EMP attack, because there's really no other logical explanation for that. That's a clear fingerprint. So that even our least technologically developed adversary that's very close to the bomb or may already have the bomb, could do an EMP attack. And don't forget, Iran is the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism. They could distance themselves even further from this attack, or the North Koreans could too. Now, you mentioned the satellites. We're oh, well, Greg, you wanted to get in with a comment here. So
yeah,
I'll get off my soapbox for a moment.
I thought you might mention the Chong Chong gang that was steaming around in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, and what it got caught with after it passed back through the Panama Canal. The North Korean Chong Chong gang.
Yeah, that's part of a lot of interesting story that happened in the year 2013. And the story actually begins a little earlier than that. In December of 2012, North Korea successfully orbited its first satellite called the KMS-2. And this satellite was on a very strange orbit, alarming to those of us in the EMP Commission that examined this, because it's on what's called a south polar trajectory. They fired it to the south, away from the United States. But what it does is it goes over the South Pole and comes up on the other side and approaches the United States at an altitude of about 400 kilometers, an important altitude. Remember that? An altitude of about 400 kilometers, and then goes on, and it does that several times a day. Why would they launch such a satellite on such a trajectory? Well, we know that Russian scientists were talking to the North Koreans and are actually present in North Korea, helping them with their nuclear missile programs. In fact, during the Cold War, the Russians developed a secret weapon called the fractional orbital bombardment system. The idea was to hide a nuclear weapon in a satellite and launch it on that south polar trajectory. We have no ballistic missile early warning radars or interceptors facing south. So we're blind and defenseless from the south side. And if you detonate that thing over the center of the country, the first indication you'd have that you were under attack is the EMP, you know, which could then fry your retaliatory capabilities. And then what the Russians planned to do was then launch their massed attack over the North Pole to complete the job and blow up our bomber bases and take out the ICBMs, which would have their command and control systems screwed up and which are fried. They might not even have to do that. The EMP attack alone might have done the job, but the Russians are very conservative in their military planning and have always believed in making the rubble bounce. So we see the North Koreans doing something like this, and with their satellite, and that was extremely alarming. And then after the third nuclear test in February of 2013, began up to that point. It was the most serious nuclear crisis we had with North Korea. And at that time, Kim Jong-un started threatening to make nuclear missile attacks against the United States that would burn America to the ground and wipe America out completely. And on April 16th, 2013, President Obama told the New York Times, don't worry about that threat. North Korea can't do it. They haven't miniaturized weapons small enough so they can be delivered by an ICBM. On that very day, April 16th, 2013, the KMS-3 flew right over President Obama's head, passing over the New York City, Washington, D.C. corridor, which is one of the areas that's ideal for doing an EMP attack because we've got so many extra high voltage transformers concentrated in the Washington, D.C., New York City corridor.
What else?
Yes.
What else happened on that day, Peter?
On that same day, there was a mysterious attack that has still been unexplained on the Metcalf transformer substation outside San Francisco, California. That substation services the Silicon Valley. So you had what we think on the EMP Commission is North Korea was practicing this future new way of warfare using EMP and cyber attacks and physical sabotage, to go after our electric grid. The KMS-3 satellite put at risk the eastern grid, which is the most important part of our national electric grid infrastructure. It produces 75% of our electricity and services most of our population. The Metcalf transformer substation put at risk the western grid because that services the other half, the other part of the country. And that attack was done by AK-47s. It was the FERC, the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, brought in the SEALs, the guys who trained U.S. Navy SEALs. And the SEALs told the FERC that this was not some kind of an amateur thing. This was done by professionals like the SEALs. It was probably done by nation state practicing for some larger attack in the future, because of all the signs that they saw at the Metcalf attack. They knew enough to access an underground tunnel, to sever a fiber optic cable that would have notified the police and brought the police on board. There were firing positions marked out so that these guys could attack the transformer at night. And somehow they mysteriously melted away minutes after the cops did finally arrive because people could hear the machine gun fire at a distance. They could hear it. And the other thing was, the SEALs concluded they actually weren't trying to destroy the transformers. They could have done it if they wanted to, but they were testing our reaction and what they could get away with. Now, the freighter that you referred to, a few months after this incident happened, the satellite going over the United States, the sabotage attack against the western grid, this North Korean freighter, appeared in the Gulf of Mexico. We didn't even know about it. And we only knew about this freighter when they tried to, it came in from the Atlantic side. And they tried to go back to North Korea through the Panama Canal. And when they were boarded to be inspected, the captain tried to commit suicide. The crew resisted violently, and we found out that in the hold, buried under thousands of bags of sugar, were 2 nuclear-capable SA-2 missiles on their launchers that could have been launched from the hold. Now, the missiles were not armed with nuclear weapons at the time, fortunately, but they are designed. their surface-to-air missiles, a perfect kind of a delivery thing to do a high-altitude attack. SAM-2s, they could go up above 30 kilometers, and they're designed to carry a 10-kiloton warhead. We think that that was part of this big exercise that the North Koreans had, where they wanted to see, could they use this new way of warfare that combines EMP and cyber attacks? And the United States was under mysterious cyber attacks all the time during this incident, to take down the United States. And then, as an insurance policy, we think that freighter was sent there, so that if the rest of that stuff didn't work, they could deliver another nuclear EMP attack by boat, by ship, that way, as sort of an insurance policy. Although it could have been timed also to go off with the satellite and the other things that the North Koreans wanted to do. The startling thing is that they were in our backyard with this capability, and we didn't even know about it. And we might never have known about it if they hadn't gotten so bold that they tried to sneak through the Panama Canal. You can almost read the minds of the North Koreans saying, well, we've gotten into their backyard, coming into the Atlantic side, and they haven't done anything. They don't even know we're here. Can we actually get through the Panama Canal? And that's where they went wrong. We kept the ship, we kept the missiles, and went to the World Court to complain about what the North Koreans were doing. Of course, that's usual. We're hoping that we can use international law and sanctions. That was the Obama administration's response, to add additional sanctions to North Korea. But basically, they followed a policy of strategic patience with the North Koreans. The North Koreans got away with all that. Obama was interested in, I think his political motive was he didn't want to be blamed for having to acknowledge that North Korea became an existential threat to the United States on his watch. And so he denied the North Korean capabilities, and left it to the next president. It turned out to be President Trump to have to deal with the problem when it, has become the very serious problem that it is. But so that's we've talked about the nuclear EMP threat scenarios and why that's a scenario that may not be deterrable. It may not be deterrable because the EMP can take out your forces. It can destroy your society with one shot, one weapon. And you might not even never know who did it. But there's another EMP threat that doesn't get enough attention. And this is the non-nuclear EMP threat. And this is becoming much more serious than it has been in the past, because our ability to design non-nuclear EMP weapons that are extremely powerful is advancing by leaps and bounds. So you don't even need a nuclear weapon to do this kind of an attack. And we ourselves have actually deployed one of these weapons. It's called the CHAMP. And you can actually Google, CHAMP on your, and look at CHAMP taking down electric grids and electronic systems. What we've done is, the non-nuclear EMP weapons have become so powerful and so compact that you can put them on a drone or a cruise missile. And you can program that drone or cruise missile to follow the high power lines and then shoot EMP pulses, microwave pulses down on control centers and transformers and fry them out as you go along. It'll take longer than a nuclear EMP attack to take down the whole country. An EMP attack would do it in seconds. It might take hours for this drone to actually hit enough transformer substations. But if you can take down the FERC, there was according to the Wall Street Journal, I have to put this carefully. Okay, according to the Wall Street Journal, the FERC did a classified study, that proved that if you took out 9 EHV transformer substations out of the 2,000 that are in the country, that might be enough to collapse the whole national electric grid and all the critical infrastructures for over a year, which would end up killing 9 of 10 Americans through starvation, disease, and societal collapse. So you wouldn't have to do much damage with these non-nuclear EMP weapons. And there are even less sophisticated ways of doing it. In my book, Blackout Force, I have a book of the EMP suitcase. This is a suitcase that's actually made by U.S. manufacturers. It's not designed to be a weapon. It's a legitimate, peaceful diagnostic tool that's used for designing airports and for laying out industrial floor space that's going to use big electromagnetic equipment. But it looks just like a suitcase that can put out 100,000 volts per meter over a couple of hundred yards, a short distance, and it can be operated and carried by one man. If you had a team of criminals or terrorists, even a madman who we've arrived at a place in the evolution of our civilization where a single individual, could topple the technological pillars for an entire metropolitan area just by himself. And potentially a team of people, terrorists, criminals, insane people, like the Antifa groups that are out rioting now. I hope they don't watch this because I don't want to give them any ideas. But if they got their hands on these things, we could black out the whole country and really erase our civilization, basically, by blacking out everything and causing an unprecedented catastrophe that would kill millions of Americans just by themselves. So those are the threats. The sun, which is inevitable, it's going to happen someday. The nuclear EMP threat from Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, international terrorists, and the non-nuclear EMP threat, that is very available and doable by anybody. So over to you, Greg. You had a question?
Yeah,
a comment.
You mentioned the 9 substation target that might take down an entire grid. I heard that the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was told this, and his reply was, we've already targeted 20. So,
right,
yeah, this is serious. And so Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia could all, through one means or another, take down our power grid. They all have the capability, the means, and maybe the motive. So let's talk a little bit about motive. Your paper that you recently put out, and there's many actors, and actually North Korea just told some people from their Moscow embassy in Russia that they were about to launch some kind of surprise attack on the United States that would take down our civilization. It's odd that they didn't make the threat to us directly as they normally did, which makes it more suspicious. But then again, they're always stating things, but they literally could do this. So, but your paper specifically was about China. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you think, why you would think China might actually execute such an attack in the near term.
Yes. The reason I put the report out at this time was for 2 reasons. First, as recently as March 2020, there was let me back up a little bit. I have to give you some background. China has illegally annexed the South China Sea, which is some of the most valuable real estate in the world, not only because it has oil resources and mineral resources, but it's probably the most important transportation choke point in the world, more important than the Straits of Hormuz, more important than the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, because most of the world's trade passes through the South China Sea to our Pacific allies and to North and South America, including the United States. Moreover, the South China Sea contains a chain of islands, and the Chinese are building more islands, artificial islands in South China Sea, so that they're basically following a strategy similar to what the Japanese did in World War II. And they're militarizing these islands with air defense missiles, potentially offensive missiles if they want to, but also using them as unsinkable aircraft carriers. And this will create a defensive perimeter that would keep our aircraft carriers out of the South China Sea and far enough away from China so that we would not be able to deter them with our conventional military powers in the U.S. Navy. And it would it will greatly diminish our security guarantees to our allies in the Pacific, when they militarize these chains. Now, 2 years ago, the Hague Court, the International Court, said it was illegal and China should evacuate the South China Sea. And so they're doing this illegally. And the United States, in protest, has occasionally will send a U.S. Navy ship into the South China Sea to fly the flag to demonstrate that we don't acknowledge China's ownership of the South China Sea. This has been annoying to the Chinese. And in March 2020, a panel of Chinese military experts got together to say, well, what can we do to stop the United States from challenging our ownership of the South China Sea? What can we do to these ships that wouldn't start World War III? And one of the things that they suggested, what they thought was one of their best ideas, and they published this in English, by the way, so they're sending us a message here. They said, well, one of the things we could do is do an EMP attack on the U.S. Navy ship, and it would disable the ship, but leave the crew alive because the pulse will pass harmlessly through their bodies. And this was March 20 that they threatened that. Earlier in that same report, I also have copious quotes from Chinese military doctrine demonstrating in the words of the Chinese themselves. You don't have to take my word for it. You can read the military doctrine in the report, that the best way to deal with the aircraft carrier threat is with a nuclear EMP attack. Because that will, the area of effect is so large that it would take out not just the aircraft carriers, but the entire escort fleet following the aircraft carriers, or it would take out a fleet of aircraft carriers. The other thing, so the first thing was, we got this warning from China in March 2020, stop challenging us in the South China Sea, stay out of the South China Sea. We're actually considering doing an EMP attack on your ships if you keep going into the South China Sea. Now we have 3 aircraft carriers. We've recently put 3 aircraft carriers in the South China Sea for the purpose of challenging China and sailing them into that area that they claim to have annexed. This is an extremely risky thing. What are the Chinese going to do? I mean, this could escalate potentially into not only an attack on our aircraft carriers, but even on the U.S. homeland. Because also in that report, I have numerous quotations from China's military doctrine proving that for over 25 years, they've been planning an EMP attack against the U.S. homeland as a way of dealing with the United States and taking down the United States. So the potential for escalation at this moment in time is great, in my opinion. And there are a couple of other factors that have happened recently. I talked about these 2. These are the 2 factors in terms of international national security that people usually think about. But there's 2 other factors that have to do with our domestic condition that I think are dangerous. I don't address these in the report, but I will, because the report is written for my national security colleagues who talk about capabilities and doctrine and the like. But in an article, not only did I raise these 2 factors, but the Chinese, all of our adversaries, watch very closely what we do. And I think they've been very impressed in the wrong way by the US government's failed response to the coronavirus. We've spent decades and billions of dollars supposedly getting ready for serious biological warfare contingencies. Biological warfare, the biological weapons threat, is not deeply classified the way the EMP threat has been deeply classified for decades. So we've known about it for a long time. Supposedly, we've been doing lots of things to prepare for it for a long time. But even I, as a national security expert professional who has worked in this area for 30 years and who has been skeptical of the competency of the US government, even I was shocked by our lack of preparedness, such that they hadn't stored ventilators and masks and pharmaceuticals to prepare for biological warfare. And even something like the coronavirus, which is not a serious biological weapon. I mean, a serious biological weapon like anthrax or genetically engineered smallpox would have over a 90% mortality rate. We now know the coronavirus has got far less than a 1% mortality rate. And we can't even deal with that. In order to deal with that, we shut down our economy and self-inflicted wounds that are Great Depression and have created all kinds of social, our critical infrastructures. There were shortages in grocery stores, from a self-inflicted wound. And emerging out of that has been societal chaos. First, people that objected to their civil liberties being trampled upon and their businesses going out of businesses, engaged in peaceful protests. But now it has morphed into a totalitarian movement on our streets that wants to eliminate our whole country, and erase our whole history. Basically, the kind of violence that we're seeing and the kind of acrimony against the United States, suggesting that we're an evil system that needs to be changed, we haven't seen this since 1968. 1968, during the countercultural revolution and the anti-war protests, was the turning point in the Vietnam War, when psychologically we lost the Vietnam War, and it began us on that long trend of defeatism that resulted in defeat in the Vietnam War and our withdrawal from Vietnam in 1975. 1968 was that key year, and all our bad guys know about that. They love 1968, what happened with America in 1968, and then they're all planning They know the best way to defeat the United States is defeatism among the American people. If you can convince our political leaders and our people that we can't win a conflict, then they don't have to win on the battlefield. You know, they can win the way North Vietnam, a pygmy, a military and economic pygmy, was able to defeat the United States. And so all these factors are combining. You know, their threat in March 2020 to do an EMP attack on our carriers are going to challenge them in the South China Sea. We've demonstrated that we're not competent to defend against serious biological weapon threats. So maybe we're not competent. They know we haven't defended against EMP yet. President Trump only put out his executive order a year ago. And so they know that's not enough time to get the country protected against EMP. And what other kinds of failures have there been in our defense preparedness, you know, since we're not prepared for biological warfare? This has got to be a great encouragement to them. And last, the fourth point, you know, to the bad guys, America might be going through the throes of another 1968, where we're torn by self-doubt about our goodness as a civilization, torn by self-doubt about whether we're on the right side of history or not, and very consumed with our economic problems right now, sort of a replay of 1938 and 1939 that preceded World War II, or what happened during the Vietnam War that resulted in our defeat there. So I think that this is an extraordinarily dangerous time. And I wanted to remind the White House and the Congress and the American people that it's still a dangerous world out there, and that things are happening in the Pacific right now, you know.
Yeah, we lost you. Hang on, I hope you come back here.
Going to happen.
There we go. We lost your connection there for a moment.
And it's such a dangerous possibility that I wanted to put up a flare. That report was putting up a flare to everybody to remind them, you know, hey, we've got bigger threats than Antifa and Black Lives Matters right now, real existential threats to our society. And this activism could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those who want to end American history, you know, could get what they want if they're not careful. Their own lives will be ended too if they're not careful.
Amen. That's a good point. Their lives are at risk because most of these people don't know how to grow their own food. You suggest only 10% of the population would survive. That would leave us like 30 million people. But Dr. Pry, I suggest that you were an optimist. I would suggest that for one, farmers won't be able to grow food as they do now because they won't have tractors to run. Most of these big tractors now have software in them. They all require fuel to be pumped and a logistics chain to maintain the vehicles, the maintenance. We're going to be back to hand tools for the most part, or running stuff that you got your own supplies for. But when you look at the fact that on a farm now, only about 1 in 8 farmers actually grow their own food. When you factor in that there's something on the order of 100,000 metric tons of spent fuel rod, nuclear waste in the cooling pools outside the containment building at the nuclear power plants that require power to keep cooling water on them that will burn on contact with air. You have something on the order of 300 times the amount of radioactive waste that you would find in all the warheads on the earth, waiting on the lights to go out and go up in smoke. So I would say, even discounting that, you might be an optimist to think that only 1/8 of your 10% would survive. That would put us down to something like 2.5%. Maybe 8 million people might be all that would survive. And those would have to be really tough, hardy people that know how to grow their own food and how to forage off the land and fight too. They're going to have to be a real scrappy, hardy people to survive that. So, like I said, I think you're an optimist. I hate to tell you that. Everybody thinks you're not an optimist.
Can I respond? No, and I actually agree with you. I agree with you. It could actually be worse than that, all right? But most of the criticism comes from people who say, oh, 90% of the people, how could that many people die? All right, that's the criticism I get from most of the press, you know, and most of people who are ignorant of these matters and who have not thought deeply about it the way you have. You know, people who are concerned with preparedness and have to think it through understand that even 90% could be an optimistic estimate. But let me tell you the story of how the EMP Commission got to that estimate, because it's not my personal estimate. That's the EMP Commission's estimate. We started off with the estimate that about 2/3 of the population could die, and we got that estimate because we said, well, if we subtracted the electric grid and the modern critical infrastructures that are based on modern technology that sustain the lives of 330 million Americans, what would that mean in terms of the sustainability of our population? And so we went back to the pre-electric grid, pre-modern technology era. You know, the first electric grid in the United States, you know, was built in 1886. Okay, and at that time the population was 60 million people, and by the turn of the century the population was only 76 million people. So we said, okay, you know, if you take so if you took away everything from the modern technology, you know, we might be able to have a population of something between 60 and 86 million, 60 and 76 million people that would be left. All right, and so we thought that that was the 2/3 dying in the aftermath of an EMP attack that destroyed the critical infrastructures and didn't recover it for a year. That was a sound estimate. But then a smart guy, a critic like yourself, who was advising the commission, a guy named Fritz Ehrmarth, who is a friend and colleague who goes back to my CIA days. And he was a smart guy who was a national security advisor to President Reagan, and he was the chairman of the National Intelligence Council during the Cold War. The National Intelligence Council is the most important part of our intelligence community in those days. It produces the National Intelligence Estimate. And Fritz said, wait a minute, you guys, you know, when you look at the United States in the period, you know, from 1880 to 1900, you know, the reason we were able to sustain a population that high was because of the critical infrastructures of that day. You know, we had steam-powered locomotives, we had a robust agricultural economy, 75% of the population were farmers, the cities were fed, you know, by this local agricultural population. Almost everybody had a well, so there was water available. We don't have any of those 19th century critical infrastructures anymore. And mind you, in that period, America was one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world from 1880 to 1900, just as we are today. And when you knock the props out from the modern technologies we have now, you're not going to go back and be able to fall back on steam-fired locomotives and the agricultural economy and 75%. And moreover, all of those people were at most one generation removed from being pioneers who knew how to live off the land and grow their own food and hunt. They had all the survival skills. Basically, everybody was a survivalist in the country, you know, from 1880 to 1900. And, you know, the modern America's people today wouldn't have the clue about how to take care of themselves. They wouldn't have access to the food. Only less than 2% of the population feeds the other 98%. So Ehrmarth basically proved by that argument that actually the population would probably fall lower than that. And you know, we came up with 90% seemed to be a reasonable estimate, you know, for what the consequences would be when there is no 19th century critical infrastructures to fall back on anymore. It would probably fall back to some population level that we had before, well before the American Civil War. And you know, and that left us with about 30 million people. But you're right. You know, you can criticize that too, and say, you know, it could probably be even be less than 90%. I think you know, I think the points you make are sound. But that's the story about how we came up with that. The more you think about it, you know, the more vulnerable you understand our society is. Could I make just another point along these lines, as long as we're talking about the mass casualties? Because to put this, I want to go to the 20,000 foot point and put this in perspective. There was there's a book I purchased. Sometime since I was originally trained, I have 2 PhDs. One is in history and archaeology, and the other one was in strategic studies. My second degree was in strategic studies, and that's what got me off into nuclear weapons and EMP and a life as a professional person working in national security. But for many years, I thought my career was going to be in history, and I actually taught history at several colleges and universities. And so I like to read history in my leisure, and I picked up a book what was that? I think it's 1276 BC, the year civilization ended. And I started reading this interesting book about how 12 centuries before Christ, there was this event that happened in the known world, in the Mediterranean world, where the great civilizations that we know from the Old Testament, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, all of them went away, except for the Egyptians, who managed to survive a cataclysm that happened at that time, because the Mediterranean was invaded by a barbarian people called the Sea People. And these agrarian civilizations had risen to a pretty high level of sophistication compared to Stone Age cultures. They had great cities, great works of art. All of them had written languages. They were great astronomers, and had literature, including things like novels that they read, myths and legends. And all of that went away because these barbarians who lived at a much lower level, they were hunter-gatherers, but they figured out that if they burned the crops and they made the roads unsafe for travel, and if they raided commerce on the seas, they basically knocked the economic and technological props out from under those agrarian civilizations that existed 12 centuries before Christ. And all of them were destroyed. They went away. And when we went into the first dark ages experienced by Western civilization that lasted about 7 centuries, only the Egyptians were still around. But that's what happened. If you have ever read the Old Testament, you ever wondered what happened to the Hittites and the Babylonians, well, that's what happened. Their civilizations went under because of that dark ages, because of the invasion by the Sea People.
Nobody knows who they were to this day. That's the weird thing. And are we in a situation like that today here in the United States?
We only know what they call themselves because we don't even know what they called themselves. We call them the Sea People because that's what the Egyptians called them in their hieroglyphs. But at the end of the book, imagine my surprise when this Oxford archaeologist says, what happened in the Great Bronze Age is similar to what could happen to us if there was an EMP attack that knocked out the electric power grid and the other critical infrastructures that eliminated the technological infrastructure that we have built to survive. And that is true. So an Oxford-educated archaeologist understands the EMP threat. God knows why. It's taken the U.S. government, it's taken President Trump, and it's taken 20 years for us. But the other thing I wanted to say about this, okay, so there was one time Western civilization the lights have gone out on us twice before. Once was 12 centuries before Christ during that first Dark Ages, but there was a second Dark Ages that came with it's usually dated from 476 AD, which is when the barbarians burned Rome. They invaded Rome and they burned Rome. And during that period, it took less than a century, but these barbarians, the Vandals, the Goths, the Visigoths, various tribes that existed at a much lower level than the Romans did. And the Romans had reached a higher level of technological sophistication, a higher level than the agrarian civilizations that came before them. They were actually on the threshold of the Industrial Revolution when Rome fell. And these barbarians, again, they learned that if you destroyed the aqueducts and made the roads unsafe for travel, you could basically knock the technological props out from under the society, and it collapsed. And Rome did collapse. And we went into the second Great Dark Ages. And this one lasted longer. The first Dark Ages lasted 7 centuries. This one lasted more than 1,000 years. Most historians believe it wasn't until the early 19th century that we actually clawed our way back technologically so that we were at a level of sophistication equal to the Romans. And that's about 1.5 centuries, almost 1,500 years. I think that, and those of us who are so concerned about this threat, we could be on the threshold of the third Great Dark Ages for Western, maybe even global civilization. One of the lessons of history that we have from these past Dark Ages is that the bigger you are, the harder you fall, and the harder it is to come back. Compared to the Romans, they climbed the technological foothills, okay? We're at the technological Everest in the Himalayas of advancement. We are very specialized now in terms of our technology and our capabilities. It takes tremendous resources and knowledge and specialization to make this society work. And we take it for granted. We turn on the water faucet and get a glass of water, and people don't understand the science and the technology that has gone into that to make that miracle possible. You know, if you want to see a miracle, turn on your faucet.
Yeah, let me cite a good example there, if you don't mind. Let me cite a good example. In the 1950s, there was this little treatise written called I-Pencil. And I-Pencil gives the case for why it takes a cast of hundreds of thousands to make a simple number 2 pencil. That was with 1950s technology. I did a video on that, by the way, in which I discussed that, and I called it the fragility of our civilization. Our civilization is precariously fragile. Most people just have no clue how fragile our civilization is. And when you shatter this, it's like Humpty Dumpty. All the king's horses and all the king's men are not going to be able to put it back together again. There's too many pieces. Even with the shutdowns that we're facing now, there's a lot of critical things that we're missing that could unravel our industrial infrastructure right now. Our supply chain is at risk.
Greg, Allison, I love you. You know, great minds with a common thought. And that's why I love being interviewed by somebody like you who's so profound, who has thought about these things. And I'm so glad you happen to mention I-Pencil. It's almost like you're reading my mind, because I remember I-Pencil. I read that. And when I was on the EMP Commission, this was back when we first started, back in 2001. I decided that we should do an experiment similar to I-Pencil. And I picked up an apple from a local Washington grocery store. And I challenged the commission. I said, maybe we should trace the history of this apple as a way of kind of demonstrating, you know, how complex our society is, what it took to get this apple into a Washington, D.C. grocery store. And we actually did it. We traced the history of that apple. And it turned out that apple came from an orchard in the state of Washington. And it was harvested mechanically. It was cleaned and packaged on an assembly line, electrical mechanical assembly line, packaged it. It was shipped in refrigeration trucks to a big regional food warehouses in the Washington, D.C., Maryland area. And then it was carried by more refrigerated trucks to that Washington, D.C., where it was waxed and polished mechanically and put for display so that somebody in Washington could pick up that apple and buy it for less than $1. You know, what a technological miracle is required to put that apple into the hands of consumers. And if we go down again, if an EMP from the sun or a nuclear weapon or non-nuclear weapon happens again, and we lose that technological miracle that has been the gift to us, you know, from 200,000 years of human evolution, it's taken us that long to get here, we might never come back from it. You know, it took 1,500 years to come back from that second dark age. How long would it come back from a third dark age? We can't afford to let it happen.
Okay.
And it will happen.
Let me add to that. One reason we might not come back is because this technological civilization that we exist in today was initiated by taking resources that were readily available on the surface of the ground practically. And when the oil rush started in Pennsylvania, you could stick a stick in the ground and oil would come gurgling up. Now you got to go out to the ocean miles out and drill a hole. You got to go into miles deep of water and drill a hole several miles more to get to the oil, or they're fracking, which requires a lot of sophistication. And then you've got to look at, you know, copper used to just be laying around on the ground. And you know, what's it take to mine it now? We're mining ores that are just a few parts per million. And the same, you know, look at what we do to mine aluminum. You will not get these resources with the kind of technology that we had even in the 1800s. You couldn't get to them. You would not be able to even develop the systems to do the mining. I don't think we come back. You know, I'm a space advocate among other things, and I like to see us spread our civilization through the stars. But I think this is the one chance we have. And if we don't, all our eggs are forever locked in this third rock from the sun. We'll never get off of it. So I think the future of mankind, the entire future of mankind is completely at risk right now by short-sightedness created by agencies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the National Electric Reliability Corporation, FERC, and NERC, by the resistance they put up to us hardening the grid. I think they are traitors and treasonous to humanity for all eternity, and they just have no clue what risk, what peril they put our species in by just trying to, you know, sweep all this under the rug so their lives are comfortable at the moment. And to me, that is such an utter disgrace. It infuriates me. That's why I'm glad people like you were out here taking the banner and charging with it. And I'm glad to see your most recent article on this finally get some traction in news and get around. This is getting around, but we've got to turn this into action to make things happen. But before we talk about a call to action, I would like to return a little bit to China and why we might expect they might actually do something. And I think it's two dimensions here. One is, well, maybe three. One, they're already seeming to want to expand, and they're getting aggressive, such as the 9-dash line seizure of the South China Sea illegally against the rulings of the Hague. Oh, they like the UN when the UN votes for them, and they're trying to get all kind of nations involved because they know we'll abide by the UN, but they have no intention of doing so themselves. Their aggression in the Himalayas, their aggression with several other countries right now is pretty evident. But the odd thing is that they've overplayed that hand so much that they've lost a lot of goodwill around the world. People may be reducing trading with them. And because of that and the recent pandemic, a lot of their factories are shuttering. So they are facing some economic challenges internally. And the leadership there may be forced to play a wag the dog situation to further advance their adventurism, their expansionism, to mollify their population, because a dictator is at best typically a sociopath, typically a psychopath, really. And when they lose power, they usually lose their lives. So they are very motivated to stay in power. And as a sociopath, they have no empathy, so they don't really care about their own people, their tools that they use to advance their own power. And furthermore, there is being a historian, we can go to history here. I'm going to let you expand on all this. You are a historian, so you would appreciate the very first historian was Thucydides. And Thucydides wrote about the Peloponnesian Wars and why a rising power would be a threat to a existing in-place power like Athens coming up against the Spartans, and why the Spartans would want to attack Athens, and why Athens would probably want to, or a nation like that, or a group like that, might want to overthrow the power they're aspiring to pass. We have that today with China, and according to Dr. Graham Allison from Harvard, his analysis said in the last 500 years, there have been 16 incidences of this, and he calls it Thucydides' trap, because in these 16 incidences, 12 or 75% resulted in war. The ones that didn't was Spain rising against Portugal, which was probably adjudicated by the Pope, carving the world in half and giving half to each one, supposedly. The next was the United States rising against the existing power of the United Kingdom, but at the time we were bailing them out in a world war, so there was not about to be a conflict in that case. The third time, which you were intimately involved in, was the United States and the Soviet Union. I don't think the Soviet Union quite had the economic oomph to really displace the United States, but they were clearly a huge threat, and we had a decadal Cold War with hot pockets of proxy wars. But in the end, fortunately, that did not transpire into a full-blown conflict. And the last case being the rise of Germany against the existing powers of France and the UK, but that was all done within the context of almost one big happy community of the European community, the EU. However, we just had Brexit, so it's clear that England's somewhat less than happy about it all, but that was not about to occur in war. So the cases, all four cases that we didn't have a war result, were special cases with strong reasons why it would not happen. But now we have the United States and China caught in what I believe is the Thucydides trap, and we're definitely posturing against each other. There's all the indications that we may go into war, and there's also Thucydides trap between India and China. So what do you think about all this in terms of likelihood that we might actually have a conflict with China, that China might actually have the motivation? We know they have the means and materials, that they might actually have the motivation to launch an EMP attack on America.
Looking at it from the broad historical perspective, the audience should understand that while we have those happy 4 cases, where war was avoided, the standard pattern in history is when great powers confront each other, there usually is a war. You mentioned Thucydides and the war between Athens and Sparta. Athens was the democracy, by the way, and Sparta was the authoritarian state, and they won that war. Thucydides was a Athenian general who had been put into exile, who complained about all the disadvantages of democracies when they face authoritarian states, militaristic states that make them less competent at war than these authoritarian militaristic states. That was part of the theme of his book, explaining how the politics of Athens ended up in the destruction of his beloved city and the end of freedom in Athens. Because when Athens lost the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans forced them to adopt a tyranny. And so that was basically the end of the golden age of Athenian democracy that actually lasted less than a century and was ended by the Peloponnesian War. Of course, we had 3 great wars, between Rome and Carthage, the first, second, and third Punic Wars. So right there, even before we've gotten out of ancient history, we already have 4 cases of where wars have happened. And if you become a student of history and want to go through military history, war actually seems pretty inevitable when it comes to the conflict between great powers. It is a rare case when a great power, especially when you've got the situation like you described, an established power, call it a superpower, then faces a challenger, a rising power that wants to displace it. All through history, including into modern times, because the explanations for the Franco-Prussian War and World War, Napoleonic France, the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I and World War II are all examples of rising powers, that really did result in world wars or big wars, and there's many such cases. So the happy face outcomes in history are vastly outnumbered by the fact of a war. And so even without knowing anything else, and you just said, well, are China and the United States likely to go to war in the future at some point? Just from counting the cases in history, one would have to answer, if you're objective, to say, yeah, it's more than likely. That's usually the way things work out in history. But there are also specific things that are happening that I think make it more likely. Not necessarily right now, although it could happen now, but at some point. One of those is that the free ride is over for China. China has enjoyed decades of being able to steal our economy, steal our technology, and victimize the United States. This is the first president that's come along and said, wait a minute, these guys are eating our lunch. They are actually seeking to displace us. They're not the friendly strategic partner, and they're not the globalists that we hoped that they would become like us. They are actually a threat to us. So we finally awoken to that threat. And one of the things that results in wars is that one side being victimized or suddenly sees, wait a minute, this guy is actually a threat. And so the Chinese know that the free lunch is over, the free ride is over, and this might be, the best time, to strike us before we've got our act together, so that we've worked out a system of alliances and military capabilities and all the rest to contend with this threat from China. We're really unready for coping with the Chinese threat right now, and they don't want us to be successful in mobilizing a world coalition against China. The whole idea of their Belt and Road Initiative was they were trying to mobilize a world coalition against us. So we've arrived at that crossroads now, transitioning from a relationship where we were apparently even willing victims to Chinese predations, but now we're stopping. We're resisting that victimization. And aggressive powers, one can know this even with aggressive personalities and personal relationships. When you tell that guy, that bully, an aggressor, to stop, and if he thinks he can beat you, he's not going to stop. That's the time when he's going to try to beat you into submission. The other factor, and this is one of the things that I should preamble this by saying, one of the great weaknesses that democratic free systems have is they don't understand that other civilizations and cultures think very differently from us, especially totalitarian and authoritarian states. They think everybody thinks the way we do and has the same values that we do, and that everybody wants peace. Why shouldn't you want peace? Isn't the highest aspiration of every society to have a prosperous economy and to be able to do well for your children? That's what we assume. And doesn't everybody understand that differences can be negotiated, right? And that's how we should deal with conflict everywhere in the world. That's what Western democracies assume, but it's untrue. What we're doing when we think that way is we're projecting our values onto a chaotic world order and onto other societies and civilizations that don't think that way. That's why the League of Nations failed. That's why the United Nations failed. When you're dealing with totalitarian,
let me add something to that. I'd like to add a point of clarification that this is what we're really talking about here is the systems of governments, the governance of the countries, the people that are in charge. They're the ones who find advantage to pitting people against each other. They're the ones that have the aspirations of more power and growth. It's the players in charge. If you could actually deal with it directly with the people of the countries, it might be different. In my experience going around the world and dealing with people from all parts of the world, I find that person to person, people are pretty much the same, but the powers that be typically pit us against each other. So I would like to add that, that this is not a video or a call against the actual people of China. The people of China, there's plenty of good people there, just like here, a lot of smart people, good people, people with good hearts, but they are ruled by a dictatorship, a tyranny that is taking advantage of them and using them as a tool, and often trying to control their minds by controlling the media that they get to. Maybe our greatest hope and aspiration would be that the people there would get rid of that tyrannical power structure that's ruining their lives and get some rule or something closer to freedom in their lives, so they could actually accomplish greater things than they've ever accomplished before. But that's not the situation we have right now. We have a tyranny in that country, and in the form of the present leadership and Xi Jinping. He is definitely the most powerful man in China since Mao Zedong, and arguably more powerful than Mao Zedong by many stretches, given what kind of systems they have available to them on the world stage. So I actually did a video in which I asked the question, is Xi Jinping actually a Hitler 2.0, and is the actual economic system in China not communism but fascism? I really question Nazism. So I've really questioned what is happening there, and I'm just questions I've asked. I did not, I'm not drawing conclusions, but I think if somehow we could be fortunate enough that the powers that be on that side of the pond where China is changed, we might be in a better position than we are today. But I also think that we're at risk because indeed a person who is a dictator like this, basically on the front of the train, they know if they fall off, it's over for them. So they're going to they'll even take chances against the population of their own country in order to maintain their power. So that's why I think they're extremely dangerous. And I do think we're in a wag the dog scenario there. And again, as you point out, this may be the perfect timing for them, because when we have it prepared, our grid is not hardened, we're just waking up, we haven't really, and we're distracted here internally right now by so many things between the pandemic and internal chaos that actually, when the pandemic started, I think my first or second video I did on that, I asked the question, could it be that China actually either released this on purpose or saw advantage in this release to use their command economy to lock their country down so it would not hit them as hard? And then when it got released elsewhere and we're really dealing with the ramifications of this, then they might just take advantage and get very adventurous. Maybe they would hit us in. So I see several dimensions here, and I've always had a philosophy: strike when the iron is hot. You better get it while the getting is good. If I put myself in their shoes and their way of thinking, I would think that there is a very credible danger that they might actually take action now. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot to respond to there. But starting off with the first part, that the that there's a lot of good people in China. I agree with you. And so did the elites in Washington agree with you for many decades, because our policy, it wasn't a deliberately self-destructive policy, our economic policy toward China and our diplomacy toward China. Our reaching out toward China by the globalists, was in hope that those good people in China, that the Chinese people, would basically see their interests in having a free political and economic system, that they would evolve to have the kinds of values that are shared by the free world community, and therefore we could peacefully evolve China in a direction by our generous economic policies and diplomatic policies, so they wouldn't be a threat to us. Now that obviously has failed catastrophically. It didn't work. And our leaders were very late in realizing that it wasn't working, because the Chinese people are under the boot of a tyrannical communist dictatorship that killed tens of millions of them during the Cultural Revolution. And it's a degree of oppression that's as bad as anything that George Orwell wrote about in the book 1984. They're even perverting technology so they can monitor every individual in China if they have to now. And our Google, unfortunately, still doesn't get it. Our own tech companies haven't caught up with this, and they're empowering the Chinese to be even bigger tyrants than they are. And so the point is that China's elites do not think the way our elites and our average Americans do, that the way you deal with problems is always through negotiation and compromise. I mean, free enterprise systems and free political systems are contract societies. The idea there is that everybody's got a point of view. You can arise at some compromise. You can sign a contract and honor the contract. That's why we have arms control treaties, for example, with Russia, that we hoped they would honor. But every year we get reports from the State Department that the Russians are cheating on all the arms control treaties, and we're so reluctant to give up on the idea that we can use a piece of paper to fend off these totalitarian states. And it's because even our elites have a real hard time. And it's one of the hardest concepts to get, that these guys, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, they all have different histories. Their histories are different from ours. Their strategic cultures and threat perceptions are different from ours. Their political leaders, their elites were not elected. Their elites are brutal men. The way to think about them, they understand, they believe in their world, political power comes out of the barrel of a gun. Violence resolves everything, including inside their societies. Their judicial systems are a joke. They're not really designed for justice. They're designed to underline the power of the elites. They have concentration camps in China, for dissenters, and they will execute and assassinate people, if necessary. And this is what they do domestically. Kim Jong-un will kill close relatives and has killed close relatives because, using poison gas. He killed his brother, I can't remember, it was in Southeast Asia or Thailand maybe, where he was visiting. But that's how they think. What you're dealing with the elites of these authoritarian and totalitarian states is basically they're a criminal elite. I think they're comparable, to understand them. Think about how the criminal gangs in Chicago, who were contesting for the control of Chicago in the 1920s, how did those guys think? Maybe you could temporarily have a peace with a rival political gang, but they were always looking to knock the other guy off, all right? They didn't believe that long-term coexistence was possible. They didn't think in their personal lives that was their experience. Their experience was that if they weren't more violent and more aggressive than the other guy, they would be the one who would get knocked off. And so they were always trying to outdo the other side. And that's how these elites think. They don't believe in the possibility of a long-term coexistence with the United States. And unfortunately, the long record of history would kind of suggest that, that great powers aren't really capable of getting along in the long term. I wish that were so.
I think you just said the key thing. They don't believe the long-term coexistence with the United States is possible. That is a major quote right there. You just
I would add, or desirable, as long as totalitarian states, not only do they want to control everything within their society, including their people and their relationships with people. Totalitarian states, that word totalitarian, it's because they want to control the totality of everything, even interpersonal relations, even the family is not excluded from control. You know, in the Soviet Union, there are statues. They put up a statue to a kid that betrayed his family. Okay, and that's what they're doing in China. They want to know from their kids if their parents are politically incorrect, so they can correct that problem. So if they want that kind of a control within their own borders, they also want that control, if they can exercise it, outside of their borders in terms of the kind of world order that they have to deal with. And the idea of a democracy being allowed to continue to exist, an alternative way of organizing your society that's based on freedom, that's based on free politics and free economics, they know that that's always going to be an attractive model to their own people. And they don't want their people to even know about the existence of such an alternative. So not only do they think it's not possible to coexist with an ideological rival, another nation state, and that it's safer to eliminate them, but they don't even think it's desirable to do that, because someday this other state that they don't control could come after them and could knock them off and pose a threat to them, even if it's by an example, and that encourages their own people. That's why North Korea would love to conquer South Korea, to eliminate that it's by its mere existence. I mean, South Korea does everything it can to show North Korea that it's not a threat, but the mere existence of a successful South Korea is intolerable to North Korea, because it's a living rebuke to the existence of North Korea. And so they feel it's not possible and not even desirable to coexist, and that they must basically eliminate these rival systems, just the way Sparta felt that it was necessary to eliminate the democratic systems. Athens wasn't the only democracy, there were others, but at the end of the Peloponnesian War, they were all wiped out and replaced with tyrannies. And China, Russia, North Korea, with the aid of modern technology, these totalitarian states that we have today make Sparta look like a good deal, a desirable state by comparison. So that's part of the problem. The other myth that's out there that people often use, and the point I was trying to get to, is that, it's kind of unique that only in America and in the Western democracies, you find the people and our strategic thinkers constantly coming up with excuses about, well, why China's not a threat, there's not going to be a war, don't worry about it. We're great. Before World War II, we now mock Neville Chamberlain, okay? How could this guy not see that Adolf Hitler was a mortal threat to the Western democracies? Well, you know what? 99% of the Western democratic elites before World War II thought just like Neville Chamberlain. They thought Winston Churchill was crazy. Only Churchill and a handful of his experts in his circle saw the threat coming, because one of the factors, one of the characteristics of our strategic culture is denial behavior toward these threats. We always want to think that the other guy thinks like us.
And we have normalcy bias, which says nothing will ever change.
I need to finish this thought. The other side, they're strategic pessimists. They see threats where they don't even exist, okay? The United States is not a threat to China. We don't want to ever be a threat to China, nor is South Korea a threat to North Korea. But their histories are so bloody, when you look at their histories and their own internal experiences of violence, that political power is to the violent men and that violence works. It convinces them that there are threats where they don't even exist. And so and that's the most dangerous combination you can have in the world, where one side is a culture of strategic optimists that doesn't see the threat coming, doesn't want to see the threat, is blind to the threat. And the other side are strategic pessimists or paranoids that see threats where they don't even exist, and are so paranoid that they might even go off without any legitimate reason to do it. And we could get into a war accidentally just because these guys are so crazy, driven crazy by their own paranoid strategic culture, that that they might see, you know, an aircraft carrier that's showing gonna go in just to show the flag, as some kind of a mortal threat that justifies a nuclear EMP attack. Now, the last point I would like. Well, no, you wanted to say something, so I'll let you.
I already did. I already made my point.
Okay. The last point, and here's one of the biggest ones that the strategic optimists use as an argument. Well, China and Russia and these other countries, surely they wouldn't want to destroy the United States, especially China, because we're their customers. And it wouldn't be in their economic interests to destroy the United States. You know, this would be bad for the global economy too. And, you know, China wants to be prosperous, just like us, and to make lots of profits. And so that's why the war won't happen. Well, that argument is used before every big war that has happened. Since 1910, there was an economist named Norman Angell who wrote a book called The Great Illusion. And Norman Angell's book, which was widely read among Western elites, and it's one of the reasons why Neville Chamberlain thought that he did the way he did, it was widely read among Western elites. Norman Angell proved in his book that the economies of Western Europe had become so integrated by 1910 that it would be in nobody's interests to have another big war like the Napoleonic Wars. And so economic self-interest would keep another great war from happening. 4 years later, World War I happened, you know, the bloodiest war in history up to that time. And you know what? Norman Angell turned out to be right. You know, the war was not in anybody's economic self-interest. The economies were destroyed. But what Norman Angell didn't understand is that when you're dealing with military dictatorships, there's things more important than the economy. More important than the economy is to eliminate rival systems, you know, that you pose as a possible existential threat to your existence. And also, you know, Germany at that time and its allies were a rising power, and their resentments against the colonial powers that were well established were so strong that they thought it was worth it to try to change the world order so that Germany would be in charge of the world order and establish a new world order. Economic prosperity could come later. They controlled that new world order, and they were in charge of the world. And the same argument was made before World War II. You know, a World War would be disastrous for the world economy, and it was. But obviously, Adolf Hitler had different ideas about what was most important, because totalitarian states and authoritarian states and military dictatorships, their highest value is not prosperity and economics and having a better economic life for your people. Their highest think of them as national security states. You know, for them, the most important thing, no matter what you have to do, no matter how bad it is for your economy, no matter how many people have to die, the most important thing is to knock off that potential rival to your future existence and to your future aspirations, to eliminate them. That is the most important thing. Then you can worry about building prosperity and making a better life for your people later. But right now, job number one, in their view, is taking out political rivals that pose an existential threat.
Yeah, let me add to that. With us off the world stage, the world is China's. China would dominate the world with us off the political stage. That would be a golden apple. That's a huge motivation for them to hit us. The world is theirs if we're gone. Moreover, some people think China might actually choose to invade the United States. Now, if they EMP'd us and a lot of our nuclear power plants, spent fuel rod pulls, went up in vapor, they might not take the eastern areas, but there'd be a lot of choice locations in the western area of the United States that they might actually try to take, which is where most of our breadbasket is located. So there's a proposition that once we pretty much eliminate each other, that they might try to come here. So what do you think about those two different prospects? One, that the world is theirs, and two, they might actually try to come here.
One of the things that our Washington elites still don't get is that we're not just facing China. That if we take on China, you know, the new Cold War And we've been in a new Cold War for quite some time. We just haven't known it. But at the other side, the new Warsaw Pact is China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and international terrorism. Even though these groups have very different ideologies, they're basically all allied together. They're working together. They want to establish a new world order favorable to themselves, controlled by themselves. And they're focused on knocking out the United States, because the world order that we live in now, that has been so favorable to world freedom and to free economies and to America's own interests, has been led by the United States since 1945. It's not a world order dominated by the United States, because we're the most benign empire in history. We're the only empire in history that it actually costs us more than we make to be an empire. You know, President Trump has woken up to that reality for us and is trying to insist that our friends carry more of the burden. You know, and it's you know, so it's been the most benign and best global order that has ever existed for the future of mankind, that has been since 1945. Let's call it Pax Americana, the way they called the 200 years of the golden age of Rome, Pax Romana, that lasted about 200 years. Ours has lasted less than a century. But as usual, you know, you have these evil rivals, totalitarian rivals, who want to displace this order. They hate this current world order because they don't want to see free political and free economic systems advance. This isn't in their interests. They see it as a mortal, our simple existence in this way is a challenge to their existence. And so they want to eliminate it. And so, yes, I think that you're right. These groups would probably fall to fighting among themselves if they once they knocked out the United States and took out this world order. Just like if the Nazis and the fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan had won World War II, I'm sure the aftermath would have been that they would have fallen to fighting among themselves afterwards. And they might have won World War II if the Soviet Union, totalitarian Soviet Union, you know, had stayed allied to Germany, and Germany had not broken the non-aggression pact. So that's I think answers the first question about the world order. In terms of exploiting the United States, yeah, I see that as a possibility and one of their motives, because we are still wealthy in natural resources ourselves, and in a way that's actually been happening during the so-called during the Cold War period, during this new Cold War period. You know, it's really kind of pathetic and interesting to me that that we have been reduced because of this economic rivalry with China, that President Trump's idea of an equitable trade balance is that we buy high-tech goods from China and they buy our soybeans. You know, I mean, it's almost like the kind of colonial relationship that we rebelled against during the American Revolution, where we had to get the manufactured goods from England. We were prohibited from doing that ourselves. We couldn't make glass. We couldn't make machinery. That was not allowed. But we could send our raw materials to England so that they could be reprocessed. And that's kind of, I think, the proof of what you're suggesting, that could become a reality, is sort of in the current trade relationship. You know, where they're not that interested in advanced technology. They want to make that stuff themselves because they know that is the source of power. But they're glad to take our agricultural products to feed their population, and they would rather that we focus on that, so that we become, you know, basically an agricultural breadbasket for them. Sort of what the Nazi Germany envisioned the Ukraine would become. You know, sort of a bunch of slaves producing foodstuffs to feed the German Empire.
Wow. So, given that, I guess the next thing to look at is, what do we do? So we've established several things. We've established that there are other powers in the world that have the means, the motive, and the capability to take us out. You know, those are all the three things that you'd normally find that would, the two things, means and motive, capability. Those are the three things that are required usually in the commission of a crime. So the possibility is there. It could happen. We're not nearly as safe as a lot of people think. The consequences are far worse than most people think. The prospects for survival are slim if this takes place. So, before I go in this final thing, let me ask you one question. I think you hit on this, and you talked about what would happen after we were gone. I think from the standpoint of Russia, their biggest fear has to be China. I would have to think they would fear China far more than they would fear us, because the population of China is so great and growing, and their population is subsiding, and they've got this huge landmass called Siberia, and they probably couldn't even maintain Moscow with the Chinese onslaught. China has to be looking to Siberia and just licking her lips and going, yeah, one day this will be ours. And Russia has to know that. Given that, do you think there's any prospect that we could cut a new deal with Russia and flip them from being our adversary to being our ally against China? They were our ally in World War II. Could we? And then they were communists. Now they are not communist anymore. I mean, Putin is still a jackboot sort of guy, a dictator, but they're far, in my opinion, it would be far easier to deal with them today than it would have been then. And they have the fear of China, and maybe, just maybe, we could flip them, and that would change the entire strategic balance that might keep China from doing crazy things. What do you think?
This is another example of great minds with a common thought, Greg. It's astonishing to me, that we've come to similar conclusions. Yes, I think it is possible, but it's very late. And that's exactly the strategy. Kurt Weldon, was one of the talented 10th in Congress. When I was on the House Armed Services Committee professional staff, I was working with Kurt Weldon. I was assigned to work with him. And that was Kurt Weldon's vision. This was during it began in the Clinton administration. And he said, what we needed to do, if we didn't want the Cold War to come back, is we needed to really make Russia a real strategic partner and integrate them into the global economic system. And he wanted to revitalize and have massive student exchanges, cooperation on space, cooperation on environmental issues, and even jointly deploy. Boris Yeltsin had proposed basically bringing back Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, and have a global space-based missile defense system for the whole world that would basically be put up there cooperatively and run cooperatively by the United States and Russia. It was a golden opportunity, because when countries cooperate militarily like that, that's what NATO was about. It's one of our successful experiments that ended the cycle of world wars in Europe by getting countries to cooperate militarily and become allied with each other. And that was the best time, the greatest chance we had to do it. But the Clinton administration flubbed it. They weren't interested. In fact, a lot of them were sympathetic to socialism and the old communist regime. They gave billions of dollars to the ex-Soviet elites, the so-called nomenclatura. We would have been better off if the U.S. Embassy passed out $100 bills to average Russians on the street. That's how Putin came to power, because the free enterprise system failed catastrophically in Russia because Clinton empowered the Russian mafia and the corrupt nomenclatura. And the Russian people thought that, well, this is what democracy and free enterprise is really like, and we don't want it. Give us this dictator, Putin, who's going to bring back Russian greatness.
Well, it was more than that. We went over and we were picking the bones clean of the former Soviet Union. Our banksters and some of our industrial captains were over there just grabbing up everything. So Putin came to power in part because the Russians needed some defense. They needed an immune system against our vultures picking their bones clean. So we really put Putin in power. We led to his regime. So
yes. And then President Bush, Clinton, Kurt Weldon didn't give up. To the two terms of President Bush, he advocated this policy of outreach to Russia and trying to turn them into a real strategic partner. But Bush was distracted by the war on terrorism, and the Pentagon couldn't overcome its old reflexive habits of thinking about Russia as our peer competitor and first enemy. And I had high hopes, because General Flynn, that was General Flynn's vision, that maybe what we needed to do was reach out to Russia. And that's the key. I agree with you, to break that. Russia is the they have more nuclear weapons than we do. They're the world's most powerful military state by virtue of the fact that they're the world's dominant nuclear superpower. You know, Russia and China together could be an unstoppable combination for us. And China thinks in the long term. They think in the long term. I think if we split off their Russian ally, you know, if we could do that somehow, you know, that China would rethink it and say, well, now is not the time to challenge the West. Let's wait. And they might even try to displace Russia as being our strategic partner, right? You know, and try to get better relations with us. So I think that there is a way out of this box that's been created where we might end up having to get into a war with China through diplomacy. Unfortunately, the Democrats sabotaged that with the Russia collusion hoax and all of that, and it's prevented this president from being as aggressive as he could in that direction. Maybe in the second term, but as I said, the best opportunity for that was when Yeltsin was the president, and before Russia became so disappointed in us in terms of being willing to really let them into the Western community and be a strategic partner with them. So it's very late, and it's never a good time to try to propose something like this when you're working from a condition of weakness. You know, will it be appealing to them to partner with us at a time when we've never been more vulnerable because of the disparity in our nuclear capabilities and the conventional capabilities. When you look at Russia and Chinese conventional capabilities put together, it's really an awesome combination. You know, but yes, that could be a way out. That's a policy I've long advocated and believed in. You know, and you know, unfortunately, we don't have. You know, we don't have. I'm trying to think of the great statesman who ended the Napoleonic Wars. You know, with the concert of Europe. His name escaped. Metternich. You know, we don't seem to have a Metternich in the State Department anywhere, and that's what we need. Someone with that kind of a vision. You know, that would say, you know, we really should be trying to turn Russia into our friend, into an enemy, because their interests, their long-term interests, are certainly there. You know, you're right about the threat that China will pose. If there is a new world order, you know, China will definitely be going after Russia. I mean, that'll be the next world war. You know, and I think the Russians know that.
And that's what I'm pulling on. That's what I'm banking on, because that, even though we missed our best chance, and I agree with you, I absolutely agree with you, we missed our best chance and our second best chance. We missed, and we're kind of on our last, possibly might have a foot to get into this, but I think Russia knows this, and we still might be able to transact this if we can move fast and get beyond all this political charade that's been going on, because our existence, and I go back, you know, we're talking about the future of humanity. We're not just talking about the future of our civilization. We're talking about something far bigger here, because the resources aren't lying on top of the ground for the next civilization that might arise 1,000, 2,000 years from now, 3,000 years from now. They're just not going to be able to come back to where we're at, and we're going to be locked here on this third rock from the sun. We're talking about the future of all time, and maybe our single best maneuver, aside from hardening our power grid, which you know, it needs to be done, is to make a deal with Russia. So let's talk about solutions. We have analyzed the threat. We've determined it's real. We've determined it's credible, and we've determined that there is a means motivation to make it happen. And with Thucydides' trap, it seems extremely probable. All that stated, we could lessen the probability by taking away some of the temptation, or at least the consequences, and getting our grid hardened, which you have been a leader in, and I have been definitely active in that area myself, as evidenced by the conferences I've run, and having you come help me testify to my own state here in Montgomery. Thank you for coming down for that, and for attending my 2 power grid defense conferences. I really appreciate that. My hat's off, and thank you for all you do in that area. But we need to get our grid hardened. Individuals need to prep themselves to survive, to protect themselves and their family. Growing a garden is one of the top things they should do, and learn these survival skills and get tough. Get out and start using hand equipment. Quit using all this power equipment. You better get tough. You better get strong if you at all can. All that said, we need to take action politically. to get our country moving toward hardening the power grid. I think the time is right now. The iron is hot. I believe you strike when the iron's hot, because your articles, your initiative, that your 10 June paper started, and the article you released also following that, has generated a lot of buzz in the media. So now might be the single best time to move out with some type of political initiative to get the grid hardening process started. You've got a lot of groundwork in this book for how local groups can do this, and I'm, as you know, am involved in the Secure the Grid effort that's going on with between all the different states on that. But tell me what you think we can do to get our grid hardened, just what we should do as our next steps going forward. What do you see next?
Well, one of the things that gives me the greatest hope is that on March 26th of 2019, President Trump signed an executive order to protect not just our electric grid, directing the U.S. government to protect the electric grid and all the life-sustaining critical infrastructures. And basically, what he's trying to do through that executive order, he's basically telling the U.S. government, the EMP Commission is right, implement the EMP Commission's recommendations. Get the grid protected and get all the critical infrastructures protected. Telecommunications, transportation, banking, and finance. And it lays out a plan in the executive order to do that, which is the EMP Commission's plan. And the White House follows the advice of my book, EMP Manhattan Project, and doesn't trust any of the departments or agencies of the U.S. government to do it, because they haven't done it up to this point. But the president is basically in charge through his national security advisor. They have to report to him yearly on what progress they have made. And the other thing that gives me great hope is that just this past December, in the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, something unprecedented in history was done. The Congress, on a bipartisan basis, passed the National Defense Authorization Act. The most important, that's the defense bill for the Department of Defense. And it's the most important bill that Congress passes. And appended to that bill, incorporated into that bill, is the president's EMP executive order, which gives it the force of law. So not only is it a presidential executive order, but it has the force of law. They are legally obliged now to implement that executive order. And it also says, you report to us too. The Congress wants them reporting to them too on an annual basis about the progress they're making. And, in the America I grew up in, when we were still a constitutional republic, when the president of the United States and the commander-in-chief gave an executive order to the U.S. government, it would happen. And that would be the end of the policy struggle. And if the Congress of the United States passed a law, especially through the defense bill, and ordered the government to do something, it would happen. And now we've got the President of the United States and the Congress of the United States both ordering the U.S. government to do it. And I'm afraid to say I've got another book out that I published on March 26th of this year called The Power and the Light. And it's not happening, or at least it's not happening as fast as it can, because we know there's this thing called the deep state. We're really not a constitutional republic anymore, the way the founders envisioned it. There's this other branch of government, which is the government itself, which has a vested bureaucracy that thinks it knows better than the president and the Congress and the EMP Commission. They have their own way of doing things. It's why we weren't prepared for the coronavirus and biological warfare, for decades. And we've invested decades and billions of dollars supposedly getting ready for biological warfare. What happened to all the money? What happened to all the plans? What happened to all the preparedness? An intelligent high school student would know that you need ventilators and masks and pharmaceuticals to deal with these things. And they weren't ready. The president had to come in and take personal charge to take care of the coronavirus problem. And I'm afraid the same thing is happening to EMP preparedness. If we let it happen, but we shouldn't let it happen. We need to keep the pressure on our president politically, and not by criticism of the president, but praising him for doing this and encouraging him to basically give the boot, to drain the swamp, to get rid of these bureaucrats, find a way to fire them, or if you can't fire them, reassign them to cafeteria duties or something, anything. In my book, I named their names. There's less than 10 people in the administration. They're Obama holdovers, all of them, They were people I've been fighting for 20 years to get the grid hardened. How come they're in charge of implementing the president's EMP executive order? They should not be in charge. Get people in there that believe it, you know? So that's part of the problem. We're so close to actually making it happen. You know, we've won every policy battle, but we're down to lobbying by the electric power industry. And by the way, most of these people have a incestuous relationship, especially in the Department of Energy. You know, the rotating door. You know, these people get their fat jobs and they have an unhealthy, dysfunctional relationship with the electric power industry that spends $150 million a year to corrupt members of Congress and members of every administration to do their bidding. And that's part of the problem. So we need to keep the political pressure on getting the grid hardened. We're so close to being able to do it, and it can be done easily. You know, it's not going to be that expensive. The EMP Commission estimated that it would cost, you know, $2 to $4 billion to protect the bulk power grid, and you know, maybe $30 billion to protect all the critical infrastructures. And it wouldn't be taxpayer money either. You know, it doesn't have to be taxed. We can do it through regulatory processes, and we've done it before. We've done it before without pain, a painless way. You know, there's a form of natural EMP, another form of natural EMP that we haven't talked about. And our country is protected against it already. And we did it without pain. It's called lightning. In the EMP world, this is called E2 EMP. You know, we talk about E1 EMP, which is basically the nuclear EMP. And then we talk all the time about the EA3 EMP, which is the EMP that comes from solar storms. But we never talk about the E2 EMP, which is this frequency of EMP that's basically like lightning. And that's because the whole country is already protected against lightning. And we did it without taxpayer money. We did it by regulatory mechanisms in place that said, well, every time you build something that's really important in the electric system, whether it's the grid or telecommunications, or even people's personal computers, our personal computers are protected against lightning. You know, if you look at the plug for your personal computer, it's a fat plug. Why is that? There's a surge arrestor in your plug, so if there's lightning striking the power line, it won't fry your computer, okay? I mean, we basically just have to do what we did for lightning. Think of EMP as super lightning. And the surge arrestors have to be faster, they have to be more powerful, but we know how to do it, and we can do it. It won't cost that much. It's not a technological problem, it's a political problem. It's a question of political will. And so we need to keep the heat on. You know, write your member of Congress. You know, tell them, you know, make sure the EMP executive order gets implemented. Write to these guys at the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security, and drag them in front of your congressional committees and cross-examine them and tell them how come they're reinventing the wheel. Why do they want to do a new study on EMP threats and the rest? This is what happened with biological warfare preparedness, by the way. It's why the ventilators didn't get purchased and the masks. Washington is unique in the country, and that these guys think that writing reports and having conferences and promoting themselves senior executive service positions is action. They consider that action against some kind of a threat. And they managed to do that for decades without really preparing us for biological warfare. And if we're not careful and vigilant, the way the founders expected us to be, you know, the founders never trusted government. And they realized that we need to govern ourselves, not just by voting, but by watching like hawks, these guys who we pay and who are our employees, to make sure they're doing their jobs. You know, there's nothing more guaranteed that if you take your eye off of especially these senior executive service characters who think they know everything and want to keep doing business as usual and don't want to do anything new, nothing's more guaranteed in life that if you don't force them to do the right thing, they're going to just keep doing business as usual. They don't even have to be a Russian agent, and some of them might be, okay, to do that. It's just an iron law of bureaucracy, to avoid responsibility and do as little as possible, and wait for your retirement so you can retire with your in a way that's more profitable to you than anybody in the private sector can retire. So that's one thing we can do, is make sure our electric grid gets protected. All the policy battles have been won. It's really down to forcing our incompetent deep state to do the right thing. The other thing that we need to do is we need to deploy space-based missile defenses. You know, we need to harden the grid because that'll protect us against everything, including the sun. But the space-based missile defenses won't protect us against the solar EMP, but it will not only protect us. You know, when you're dealing with an existential threat like EMP, you want belts and suspenders. Belts and suspenders. You know, I don't want to put all of our civilization's eggs in one basket and hope that, you know, when the EMP comes, we've hardened the grid adequately and nothing will fail. All right. I would much rather have the EMP never happen, you know, by shooting down that missile and shooting down that warhead before it ever reaches our shores. So that's the other thing that we need to do. And I had great hope that when President Trump established the U.S. Space Force, I know the reason he did that is because he's trying to realize Ronald Reagan's vision that was also thwarted by the deep state bureaucracy to establish a missile shield in space that would render nuclear missiles obsolete and create put our historical strategic situation into a new cycle of history that favors the defense. That's something else we can do. In addition to diplomacy, we can change the technological strategic environment to favor the defense. You know, that's one of the surest guarantees of peace also, because when the bad guys calculate, can I get away with a first strike, a disarming first strike? Technology has never been better suited to favoring the aggressor than it is right now. You know, the guy who strikes first with surprise can win. You know, hands down. It's never been more, you can almost do a mathematical calculation to ensure it in a way to a confidence level that has never existed before in history. We need to upset that equation. We need to upset that equation and turn that equation on its head so that the defender is the one who will win if you try shooting first.
Right. So let me amplify on that. You talked about the paranoia of these dictators, and they do tend to be paranoid because they know they've got all kind of forces to displace them. They survive by paranoia. A lot of people don't understand that. So if they think there's a possibility that we might hit them, they are very likely to hit us first if they think that's the case, because that's how they win.
Yes, that's right. And they don't believe that our promises, our assurances that we mean them no harm, that we would never strike first. They don't believe that at all. They think that we think just the way they do. They plan to strike first. They plan to strike with surprise. We know that, you know, including the Soviet Union with its unclassified archives. In my report, you know, I debunked this no first use pledge from China, which I think is pure fiction. It's meant to mislead our planners into lowering our guard. You know, if you take a look at the strategic posture of China, a no first use pledge makes no sense. They have no ballistic missile early warning radars. They have no satellites. They can't afford to go second. Russia or the United States would be able to prevail and wipe out their nuclear deterrent with conventional forces, or India would be able to take them out with a nuclear strike if they really believed in a no first use policy. Their strategic posture only makes sense for early use of nuclear weapons in a surprise fashion before they get hit. And that's how they look at our capabilities, not our promises and what our policies are. They look at our capabilities. And since we also have offensive nuclear capabilities for executing a first strike, that's what they think they would do. And then, as a matter of fact, that can result in an accidental nuclear war. We nearly had one. I wrote a whole book on it called War Scare. And one of the chapters talks about a number of war scares, but one of the worst and the closest we ever came to a nuclear war was not when we confronted the USSR during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was when we had the most benign president of Russia. It was Boris Yeltsin in 1995. You know, there was a Norwegian missile. I called it the Norwegian Missile Crisis in the book. They were doing a space experiment. They were exploring the Aurora Borealis. And the sounding rocket, you know, it was a multi-stage rocket. It had dimensions similar to the D5 Trident SLBM. It came out of the Barents Sea, the Andoy Island of the Barents Sea, that was roughly where our forward patrol areas for ballistic missile submarines are. That's how they would attack us with an EMP attack to disarm us. And they thought we were doing that at the same time. You know, the General Staff concluded that. They were yelling at Boris Yeltsin to push the button. The only reason he didn't is he couldn't believe the United States was going to attack us. But all the bad guys surrounding him, his general staff, his early warning experts who had done the threat conference concluded that they were under nuclear attack. We never came so close. There was an actual missile in flight. The whole thing lasted only 20 minutes. We've never had a situation where all three Chegets, that's their equivalent of the nuclear football, any one of those guys could have pushed the button to launch a nuclear attack. Fortunately, they deferred to Yeltsin and followed the president's lead on that, but they didn't want to. Grachev and Kolesnikov, who were the other Cheget holders, one was the defense minister, the other was the chief of the general staff, wanted Yeltsin to push the button. And that alcoholic, the whole fate of Western civilization hinged on this alcoholic not pushing the button when his chief generals were yelling at him to do it. That was a really close call.
So, yeah, if he had been drunk, we'd have been in trouble.
To prevent, a nuclear war from happening by accident or in reality by deliberate aggression, and to change the calculus, to change the strategic equation, because space-based missile defenses is such a revolutionary technology that it can deprive those who have invested all this money in these offensive, aggressive, first strike capabilities and put them on the ash heap of history. I would be delighted to have an arms race with Russia and China over space-based missile defenses, so that the sides get more and more robust missile defenses. That is another way of guaranteeing the peace technologically, by putting us into a new cycle where the military technology, the cutting and most effective military technology of the times in which we live, favors peace.
Yeah. Let me chime in on that, on a couple of things. One, that was a Black Brant rocket. There were guys from NASA Wallops involved in that launch. I knew some of the guys who were involved in that launch. Little did they know they were on the verge of triggering a massive nuclear retaliation in World War III. They actually called the Soviet Union desk that they were supposed to call to notify them of the rocket launch, but there was some guy in there. He thought, no, yeah, go ahead, no big problem. He didn't report it back to Moscow. That was the problem.
And he didn't know he was supposed to pass the ballistic launch notification to the general staff. He notified some commercial airlines, but he did, But anyway, yeah, it was really an accident where a bureaucrat didn't know how to do his job, and that clerical error nearly resulted in a nuclear World War III.
Amen. Amen. So, yeah, I actually worked missile defense for a while myself. So I think maybe we could do a talk on my, I have another channel. It's smaller at the time, but it's a space-oriented channel called Galactic Greg. So maybe we could do a follow-up on missile Space Force on that channel if you're mean to it. So
we'd be delighted. We need to fight the deep state on that too, because the Pentagon doesn't want the U.S. Space Force to be all it can be. They're basically trying to turn the U.S. Space Force into increasing the offensive capabilities of our triad, okay, which actually makes the situation worse. Not the defensive aspects where you can use space-based defenses, to actually intercept adversary missiles. And just today, I think I saw it, that Mike Griffin, who was one of my best hopes, he was a friend of Ambassador Cooper, who I think who headed up the SDI program. He was one of my best hopes that we would get a strategic defense initiative, that we would get space-based defenses. Well, he resigned effective today. That's not a good thing. He's been very frustrated, that the bad guys, these bureaucrats want to continue business as usual. Business as usual. Let's keep mutual assured destruction going. That's the future. That is doomed to fail. Remember this: people who believe in deterrence and the deterrence will solve everything. That something like mutual assured destruction is what you want to. You don't want to bank the security and lives of your grandchildren on mutual assured destruction or on deterrence theory. Every war that has ever been fought up to and after the invention of nuclear weapons is an example of the failure of deterrence.
That's an excellent point. And furthermore, a lot of people don't understand that missile defense actually is deterrent systems. They don't attack populations. They're often misportrayed by the media, and the public has a perception of them as if they're offensive weapons. No, they attack systems that will attack people. They stop the nuclear bombs. Some people say, well, it might invite a further war, because now that look, we're not the aggressor country in the world anyway. And as you said, if everybody had them, then I think we'd all be better off in terms of the use of these kinds of weapons against each other. So there's a lot to be said for that. In fact, there's a calendar hanging up down on my wall behind me. It came from I think it's a 1988 calendar from back in the day when I was working missile defense, back in when it was called Star Wars under President Reagan. I worked for the Exoatmospheric Reentry Interceptor Subsystem Project Office at the time. So yeah, I'm familiar with strategic defense and missile defense. And like yourself, I'm not a history major, but I've always been a very big fan of history. When I was in high school, I was reading books on military strategy and things like that. So I've always been interested in all these topics and what's going on in the world. So just to kind of codify, what we're talking about here are solutions. Is we need to write our congressmen to get them to enforce these laws that are already passed. And maybe if you want to send me some stuff on this, I can start putting it out through my channels. I'm actually trying to develop a survivor network within my channel of survival communities and tribes. And that might be useful also, or something along those lines, as an outreach mechanism to how people contact Congress and things like that. And I'm also connected to a couple of other activist organizations that might be able to take effect here. And so I will start maybe with this video and more in subsequent videos, posting links and things that people can use for how to take action. And also people do need to contact their local public services commission, the head of the Emergency Management Association, their state EMA director. And you and I briefed the Alabama State EMA director, the governor's special projects coordinator, and our public services commission, which is elected here in Alabama, by the way, Twinkle Kavanaugh. There were several people, and we like 20 people that we briefed in Montgomery back a couple of years ago. So these are things that everybody can do. Everybody can get involved in this. And an individual, even though you may not be a professional in these areas, you can have a big impact on public policy because you are a voter. And when enough of us start talking, they have to listen. And I know this works because I've been involved in space advocacy from a grassroots organization standpoint most of my life. And we've made major changes in the things we've done in public governmental policy by having just activists. I'm talking about housewives, truck drivers, doctors, janitors, go to Washington, D.C. and run the halls of Congress. I've led groups doing that, and we've had very interesting impact on that. So you can be involved. You can take action. It's not beyond you to be able to influence the future. We're talking about the fate of humanity, not just, us today. And we're talking about something huge here. This is really big. And it's insane that we've ignored this as much as we have. So we can take action, but first and foremost, you need to take care of yourself and your family, and that's why you need to prepare. You need to grow your own food, your own garden, learn how to forage from the wilds. I'm covering videos on that. Check my videos on my channel. Subscribe to my channel if you've not done it. Bang my update notification bell and check the links below because these are things that will help you survive, thrive, and stay out of the hive. But Peter, I'm going to let you close out. Give me your final thoughts on where you think we are and what we need to do.
I want to reinforce and endorse what you just said, about also acting at the level of the states. That's really the whole theme of my book, Blackout Wars. In fact, you don't want to wait for Washington. We should do everything in our power, writing our congressmen, congratulating President Trump, urging him, to make sure the grid gets hardened and to drain the swamp. But he could lose, and the Congress could lose in this struggle to get the national grid protected. The deep state has been very effective at getting what it wants. So you don't want to gamble on Washington doing the right thing. The good guys could lose in Washington. Even now, even though it's a matter of law, and even though we've got the right public policy, it is possible to harden the grid within your own state, the state where you live. So you should also be activist against the governor and the state legislature and try to get them in that book. There's an executive order, a blank executive order. All it would have to do is be signed by the governor and insert the name of your state. And it would begin the process of EMP protecting the state in which you live. There's also a blank legislative bill in the book Blackout was. A member of the state legislature, you must have a committee on energy in your state legislature someplace. If the energy committee passed that bill and it got passed by the larger state legislature and got signed by the governor, that too would start your state on the path to being protected from EMP. And if you hardened the transformers and the generators and the control systems within your state, it's possible to keep the lights on in the state in which you live, even though the rest of the country goes down. And so we need to be activists both at the federal level as well as the level of the states. And as Greg has said, you can also protect your communities and your families and be prepared at that level as well. You should be prepared for things that would be not only in the EMP threat, but there are other kinds of threats like cyber threats that could take out the grid or sabotage, or there might be a local storms in your area that would take out the grid. So you should be prepared for all these things the way our grandparents were. My parents had never heard of EMP, but they were prepared for anything, because I think the great generation that won World War II and lived through the Great Depression, they were the last of that pioneer stock that believed in self-sufficiency and rugged individualism. You should have, and they had a food. My parents were prepared for anything. They had enough food, water supply, they had a medicine kit and knew how to use it. My father taught us how to use firearms, not just for recreation and hunting, but because that's how he fed his family through the Great Depression, by hunting woodchucks. They called them Hoover hogs. So, we need to recapture those values and practices of the great generation and be prepared so that we can survive on our own without government. It was a matter of pride for them. And they weren't fearful people. They were, the fact that they knew they could guarantee their survival and take care of their relatives and their children made them more comfortable in life and less fearful of life, not more fearful, because they were prepared. And so we need to prepare as individuals and as communities as well. And I think we have an ethical obligation. Those of us who have the resources to be prepared have an ethical obligation to be prepared so that we can rescue our neighbors and our friends and be available for them too if they are unprepared. And this would reduce the burden on local and state and federal governments who may, if the crisis comes, be less prepared, so that we, from the bottom up, can join forces with those working from the top down and maybe save this greatest civilization that has ever existed on the face of the earth and pass it on more or less intact, at least the values, to our children and grandchildren, so it will continue. And we do not have to go into some kind of totalitarian new dark ages.
If we survive even, amen. So, back in the day, it was called living. Today we call it prepping, but back in the day, everyone was preppers. I mean, that's just was the way of life. Now, there's one final thing I'd like to point out. There are some people that are taking solace in their buying these little they think their home's going to be protected because they're buying these chintzy little devices and plastic with a few components potted with wires that aren't much bigger than this. And they're told that that's going to protect their home from several 100,000 amps of current. Those wires aren't even as big as a battery cables on a car. And I'm an electrical engineer, and I used to design machines that would take 400 amps, and I had to put wires into them yay big around, like hose pipes, just to conduct that current for a few hundred amps. I failed to see how, and also my military training, when I was in the Army and working the electronic systems, we were told that we had to physically disconnect everything to be able to survive an EMP, that you had to have a radio set that was totally they built them in Faraday cages. The box they were in was a Faraday cage. And everything had to be completely disconnected from at least one set, or you would not survive an EMP. That if you had a switch, even with the poles very far apart, that current was so, the voltage was so high that you would get an arc that would jump. And you can see this in the power stations when they break the circuits. They have these breakers that span feet, and you can see like lightning extend between them as they span these feet. That's not the kind of voltage we're talking about with EMP. So I fail to see how anybody can find comfort in buying devices like that for their home. But even if your home didn't get burnt down by the effects, the grid would be gone. So you can't have the solace that the grid's going to continue because you got these things. But furthermore, I fail to see, and nobody in our community, in the EMP community, and I've been quite involved in this community for several years now, as you well know, I've never heard anybody endorse such devices. I've never heard anybody even speak of using such things. I get this from the outside, hearing about these kind of things. So what do you think about that?
Well, I don't want to mention names because I don't want to be sued by the manufacturer.
Right,
and I
right.
don't have the legal resources to go after them. But there is a particular company that annoys me because they're constantly citing my articles, to promote their junk. Because you're absolutely right. There are unscrupulous people out there on the internet that are selling devices that make false promises, about being able to protect your home, protect your car. And the truth is that these things are comprised of less than $10 worth of junk electronic parts, and they're scam artists. And I blame the Department of Homeland Security in part for letting this happen. There should be, DHS should be advising consumers, about what products are legitimate and can be purchased, and that will actually do the job. The deep state fails once again. The president has passed an executive order. This is EMP is officially recognized as an existential threat. We need to be protecting the country, and people who protect themselves are helping the country. So DHS should be helping people by by having a consumer reports thing on some of this stuff to warn people. Yeah, I don't think people should. Please don't waste your money on these things. You'd be much better off investing in food or a medicine kit and in common sense kind of preparedness. The way the Great Generation did. So I'm in violent agreement with you, and I just wish I had the resources to bring legal suit against some of these companies that are advertising and have never even asked my permission. But they by citing one of my articles or quoting one of my articles, they imply falsely to the public that I have endorsed their product, and I don't. I have never endorsed any of these products. I'm a nonprofit. The EMP Task Force is both a congressional advisory board and a nonprofit, and we're not even legally allowed to endorse these independent products.
Bingo. Well, they have gone after someone in our community. He took down some videos he produced showing, digging their components out, showing what they really were. So he took all those videos down because they went after him. So hey, I'm glad to see you're living in a log cabin there. I can tell from behind the flag there.
It's a log cabin, older than the Civil War, and we're within a close distance. I'm here on Lake Anna, about 80 miles as the bird flies from Washington. So my family is far enough away from Washington, so if it gets nuked, we'll be okay. But it's close enough so that I can commute, in a couple of hours and be there when I have to. And we're within bicycling distance of some of the great battlefields of the Civil War: the Spotsylvania battlefield, the Wilderness, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg. And things have changed a little since here. I think I'm the only government bureaucrat, living in this vicinity. Most of the people are farmers and small tradesmen, living much the way they did during the Civil War, and still proud of their heritage. It's a good place to live.
Well, that just proves to me that you walk your talk, that you're backing it up. You yourself have the good makings of being a prepper, and I suspect you really are. I gathered that just from looking at your wall, being an observant person. I do have a log barn, by the way. So I love log buildings. All right, that said, any other final thoughts, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Well, just thank you for letting me be here today, Greg, and for giving me a forum so that I can talk to your audience and perhaps mobilize some of the American people. I hope they follow your advice and your clarion call to action. One person can make a difference. One person can make a difference. There was a Democrat in the state of Maine who called me and asked me to help her get the state of Maine protected. We started out with that one person. She was a state representative, that one state representative, and she got a bill passed through the Maine. Her story is in the book Blackout Wars. And there are other cases. Several states have passed legislation to try to protect their states. And the stories are interesting. The stories that are successful and also the stories that are failures are interesting. The book is basically a handbook to teach you how to be an EMP warrior and what you can do as an individual. Just one person can make that difference. You got a bill passed the Maine state legislature and the governor signed it in 6 months. In 6 months. And Washington and the federal government, Congress, didn't pass anything for years. It's taken us 20 years to get an executive order from the President of the United States, but we got that bill through Maine in 6 months. And Maine actually started making progress on protecting its grid. But then, unfortunately, the NERC and the EPRI and the electric power industry lobbies came in and stopped progress. They stopped the progress, and so they started the process, but I just don't have the resources to fight against the big electric power lobbies. But now that we've got a presidential executive order at our back and the Congress at our back, everybody in all the states should take the lead, because one person can make the difference. You can save your state and your family, and maybe they'll put up a statue to you that Antifa won't be able to tear down.
Well, you bring up a great point there. And the truth of the matter is, you don't have to wear tights and a cape to be a hero, a superhero. In fact, everyone who's involved in this, in my opinion, is a hero, because you are trying to save our world, your families, and the very future of humanity. I mean, really, that's what it boils down to. That you have, each of you, individuals, can play a role in saving the very future of humanity. And it can be quite simple. That what you have to do, just using your phone, your email, you can be a true, real superhero. And Peter, you are one of my great superheroes. I really appreciate everything you've done. It's enormous. I've got your book. It's a great book, and it does have a blueprint for what people can do to take action. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything you do, Peter. Thank you so much. And we can stay on for a couple minutes and chat after I end the recording. So I just wanted to say that. Do you want to say anything else?
Well, the feeling is mutual, Greg. Thank you for having me. And I actually think that people like you are bigger superheroes than I am. In a sense, I really have no moral choice. I have to do this, because everybody who belonged to the EMP Commission and who served in the intelligence community and the Department of Defense and knew about this threat, while it was deeply classified, we were privileged to have that position. And I think we're on the hook. How could I morally, knowing about this threat to civilization, now go and retire or get some fat job working for a defense contractor doing something else? I'm sort of on the hook the way Winston Churchill was on the hook. I'm not comparing myself to him, but people who know about, if you knew World War II was coming and the Blitzkrieg was this real new way of warfare that could end civilization and bring on a totalitarian tyranny, how could you not do it? You are just obligated to do everything within your power to do it. But people like yourself, it's just the purest patriotism and the larger historical vision that you have. People like yourself are not on the hot seat, as it were, like me. You volunteers are the real superheroes, bigger superheroes than us. I'm sort of like Ahab. I have no choice but to go after the great white whale that is EMP. I have to do it. It's my fate. But thank you for all who are willing to help me and maybe come on board the Prequel and help us track that monster down and hopefully kill it.
All right, let's do that. Let's track that monster down and kill it. Let's get this risk off the table so that we've got a prosperous future in front of us. I do believe we can have a bright, prosperous future, that humanity can accomplish things that would blow your socks up. But we got to get past these dumb things that are threatening to pull us down and put us to an end, to put out our lights, literally and figuratively, right now. So I really want to thank everybody that's watched it to this far. If you've watched me this far in this video, say, hey, we do love the Constitution. We'd like to turn this nation to a responsible country once again. Put that in the message below. I know you've watched it this far. And again, you too can be a superhero. So if you don't want to say you love the Constitution, just say, hey, I can be a superhero. You can. You can be a superhero, literally, for all eternity, for all mankind. We have the prospects that we can green the universe, to take the life and spread it, so the universe can have eyes and ears to see and appreciate itself. So it goes way far beyond anything you can even imagine. We've got to do this. We have to do it. And so join with me and join in with Dr. Peter Pry to make this world a safe, successful world that can have prosperity and freedom as far as we can see into the future. And Dr. Pry, greatly thank you for coming on my channel and for being here today for this interview. Yeah, we've gone long. I hope people have stayed with us. And thank all of you who've watched this. And please share this video very widely. Everyone needs to know what's in it. This is a very long video. I know a lot of people don't like to watch long videos, but all this information is packed with very vital information and perspectives that people need to understand to get what's going on here. So once again, I want to say to everyone, thank you for watching.